Good afternoon and welcome back to the 2022 School for Advanced Research Colloquium Series. My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and I have the great privilege of introducing today's speaker and topic. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jennifer O'Neill. Dr. O'Neill earned a PhD in history at Georgetown University and two master's degrees at the universities of Arizona and Utah. And she has also held positions at the Smithsonian Institution and the U.S. Department of State. Dr. O'Neill is an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde in Oregon. Today, she will be speaking about the project that has brought her to SAR for the year to write a book on, and the title of the talk is Beyond the Trail of Broken Treaties, the International Native American Rights Movement, 1975 to 1980. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer O'Neill. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining my talk today. I would like to thank the School for Advanced Research for this opportunity to serve as the Catherine Lamon Fellow and their support to have this dedicated time to focus on my book project. I want to start with a following territorial acknowledgement. In following the Indigenous protocol of acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, I want to acknowledge that I'm presenting today from the traditional homelands of the Tewa people. Surrounding this region are the lands of the Pueblo, Apache, and Dene communities. I express my respect to many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to all other displaced Indigenous people who call New Mexico home. I honor and recognize elders past, present, and emerging. I am a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde in Oregon, and I recognize and honor my family, elders, community, and the support they have given me over the years dedicated to this research. Hayumasi. So, as was mentioned, the title of my talk is Beyond the Trail of Broken Treaties, the International Indian Rights Movement, 1975 to 1980. And as part of my presentation today, I will be covering a variety of different topics, more in a general sense, to give you a general overview of my project. I will go into some specific case studies and highlight some of my findings. And I wanted to just briefly go over kind of where I'll be taking you on this presentation today. I will start with this overview, with giving you a little bit of context with my story, how I came to focus on this project and why it's important to me. I will also focus on giving you just a general overview context of this time period, also providing you with some of the core findings, approach, methods of this project, and then of course some final reflection and conclusion. And then I will also just be highlighting throughout this some of the core issues that are most important to this project. But first I want to start with covering a little bit of how I came to this project, how I first started to have interest and focus on this topic. According to Native American scholar Thomas King, stories are all that we are. This is my story. For most Indigenous people, history is personal, meaningful, and contradictory all at the same time. There is no getting around it. We are inextricably linked to our history, and for many we choose paths that allow us to remain continually connected to those histories. We do this with purpose and passion to honor those that have come before us and those that will come after us, in the hopes that we will help to tell our stories and leave this earth a better place. Through telling our histories, we remind others, often non-natives, that we have been here since time immemorial, and that despite all efforts over hundreds of years to colonize, control, assimilate, and erase us, we are still here and will always be here, grounded in resilience, survivance, and resurgence. Through telling our stories, we celebrate our history, culture, and lifeways from our perspective. As a Native American woman actively working at the intersections of history, foreign relations, and archives, my work is grounded in the work of telling and centering our histories from our perspective. Prior to beginning work on my PhD, but shortly after receiving master's degrees in history and information studies, I worked as a historian at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C., working within the Office of the Historian and later in the Office of Treaty Affairs. Depending on the requests coming from the Secretary's office, our team was tasked with researching and writing various studies, as well as answering daily inquiries related to the history of the United States foreign relations on any given topic. In my position, I spent much of my first year conducting countless hours of research at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, or in the Department of State Library researching these issues. During this time, I would often walk the stacks of the library, pursuing titles and items along the way to find the book I needed. It was on one of these occasions I came across a small pamphlet that stopped me in my tracks, titled "The Relationship of the American Indian to U.S. Foreign Affairs." The publication was authored by Hendrik van Os as part of the 10th session of the Senior Seminar in Foreign Policy held in Washington, D.C. between 1967 and 1968. The author was a Foreign Service officer, non-native, and had originally planned to publish about his service abroad. When his assignment was canceled, he was forced to select a new topic on short notice with wholly United States sources. In a short 16-page report, Van Os examined the role played by Native Americans in the foreign relations of the United States. This document had stopped me in my tracks, and I was so interested in it because normally you do not see in modern 20th century documents Native Americans connected to foreign relations in the United States, especially in the late 1960s. He concluded that the American Indian should be encouraged to participate more fully in U.S. foreign affairs, as his cultural background and current experiences have given him special insight into the problems of the lesser developed world. The American Indian, he argued, can contribute in meaningful fashion to the conduct of our foreign relations and should be encouraged to do so. Van Os made specific recommendations such as recruiting Native Americans into the Foreign Service, into the foreign servants, since their background and circumstances within a colonized environment, along with their unique heritage, equip them with qualities not available in precisely the same combination to members of any other group in this country. In addition, he also recommended bolstering knowledge of Native American issues within the Foreign Service training. Finally, the report suggested that Foreign Service officers should be assigned to the Bureau of Indian Affairs or on directly to reservations to benefit the officers an opportunity to, quote, learn how to work with people of a different cultural background and to become familiar with conditions which will be extremely relevant to their future assignments in lesser developed countries, end quote, while also benefiting the Bureau of Indian Affairs with fresh approaches. The fact that this topic was being investigated and these recommendations were suggested in the height of the termination era, the civil rights movement, and the impending occupation of Alcatraz struck me as remarkable. More importantly, it made me think, did anything come of this report? It's unclear from the records how well circulated the report was across the Foreign Service and who in the Department of State may have responded to these recommendations. At this point in time, the department was most likely far too focused on the war in Vietnam and other foreign affairs matters to take the time to respond to this case study, which may have been categorized as simply a domestic issue. But it was this interaction with this source early on in my career that continued to interest me. I wanted to know more about this time period in Native American and international relations history generally, and specifically, why weren't these topics more central to Native American activist history, especially in the Red Power movement between the late 1960s and 1970s. It was from this moment that I began to consider so many questions about the role of Native Americans in international relations, a topic you don't often hear about in 20th century history. Questions like, why weren't Native Americans centered in foreign relations history when their nations carry out diplomatic relations with the United States and other foreign governments? I was, of course, not naive. I knew the answer to these questions. We were not included in these histories nor asked to be active participants in the Foreign Service because our role as diplomats would be seen at odds with domestic Native American issues, and our policies were to be managed in the Department of Interior, specifically within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The move from diplomatic relations in the late 18th century to domestic dependent nations in the early 19th century framed much of this logic. Yet Indigenous peoples' acts of diplomatic and international relations continued well past the established definitions set out by the United States federal government. I knew the Bureau of Indian Affairs had long been the official organization that coordinated Native American issues, but I still wanted to know why the role of Native Americans in diplomacy, specifically international relations and human rights issues, were not documented and analyzed more prominently in the diplomatic relations and international fields. Why was the field not connecting with scholars in Native American studies who were focused on these issues? Why did international relations continue to center the nation state rather than Indigenous people, sovereignty, and Native nations who had engaged in diplomacy for thousands of years? How could a discipline dedicated to foreign relations completely erase or ignore the role of Native Americans in international relations? These questions framed my curiosity and research questions as I began this project. I was determined to investigate these questions and center Indigenous people in international relations. Simultaneous to my interest in international relations work, I also had part of my career devoted to the preservation of Native American archives, especially those at non-tribal repositories. In addition to my time at the State Department, I also worked at the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian Institution, specifically heading up the Archives Center. In 2006, I was fortunate to be part of a group that drafted a document called the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials to give guidance on the proper care of Native American archives housed at non-tribal repositories. This brought together various historians, archivists, anthropologists, and tribal community members from across the United States, and with invited guests from international Indigenous people who had developed guidelines similar, including representatives from Australia. Over the next 10 years, members of the group and other allies presented, discussed, and worked to have organizations and repositories endorse and implement the guidelines. At the same time, when we first began the work on the protocols, the final stages of the passage of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or commonly known as UNDRIP, were taking place. This is where all of these interests, questions, and passions converged. Native Americans in international relations, the struggle of fighting from within the nation state, the length of time it takes to make substantial structural changes to the system, and the dedication it takes to keep going. The entire process to develop and pass the protocols, it reminded me of all the activists that worked for over 30 years from across the globe to address similar transnational issues with UNDRIP. The time and dedication to work within a system that was inherently not built for them and continue to erase their existence was enormous. This raised questions about where did this all begin and which Native Americans first began to ask these important questions about sovereignty and self-determination in an international context. This is where my idea for this project began and what set me on this journey to tell these stories, focusing on this time period during the Red Power movement, but specifically building upon the work of scholars during that time period and those coming afterwards as well. Specifically, this work builds upon the work of Vine Deloria and his work Behind the Trail of Broken Treaties, and the specific focus on an international perspective. In 1974, he said, quote, "The fear of the United States is that Indians may become a world issue, and that the carefully constructed theories concerning the demise of the American Indian may be revealed to a startled world as slightly premature." Vine Deloria's reflection marks a major turning point in Native American history as activists and organizations in the emerging self-determination era of the mid-1970s we're transitioning out of a domestic rights movement to one focused on international rights to bring global awareness, justice, and human rights for Indigenous peoples. Activists dared to imagine a different world for Native Americans where their lands, lifeways, and traditions would finally be honored, respected, protected, and centered not only domestically within the nation state through treaties, but also globally according to international law and policy. They knew that any type of significant change to the status quo in the United States would take considerable time. Thus, activists, leaders, and organizations began to set that foundation and explore what an international approach would entail and require, yet each organization approached this work with different tactics, exploring this new self-determination era in diverse ways, with the goal of enacting and increasing Native American sovereignty and human rights. The groundwork begun by these activists in the 1970s set the much-needed foundation for the transformational work that would continue over the next 30 years as part of the larger international Indigenous movement focused on the development and passage of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this study examines the transformational shift beginning in the early 1970s up until the late 1970s of organized Native American and Indigenous groups within the United States and Canada to internationalize Indigenous activism, and specifically the role and impact of Native American activists and organizations. Utilizing core Indigenous decolonizing concepts as well as human rights frameworks, this work argues that Native American activism after the American Indian movement shifted significantly from a domestic agenda to an international Indigenous initiative focused on bringing global attention to Native American sovereignty, self-determination, and human rights. These Native American activists specifically sought international support from other Indigenous communities who understood their plight, connecting and aligning with other oppressed, colonized Indigenous groups in the world with similar challenges and historical backgrounds provided Native American activists collaborative strength in their domestic struggles. Highlighting reasons for the international Indigenous evolution, my study examines the organizational and activist strategies that circumvented the nation state and how this approach increased Native American sovereignty and self-determination both internationally and domestically, while also facing major political changes throughout the process. I use a comparative international approach is utilized to illustrate that the political issues Native Americans encountered in the United States during the 1970s were similar to those encountered by other Indigenous groups throughout the Western Hemisphere. The work specifically focuses on the transformation of the international Indigenous movement in the United States after Wounded Knee in 1974 and up to the International NGO Conference on Indigenous Peoples and the Land in 1981 to analyze and trace the change in tactics and strategies through specific case studies of Indigenous organizations, leaders, and initiatives. The time period after Wounded Knee is a key time period for Native Americans in the continual shifting and evolving federal relations with the United States that affected their local tribal communities, especially concerning self-determination and sovereignty. As such, this work directly examines the political era of the late 1970s, specifically how Native American leaders, activists, and community members struggled with defining the continually evolving concepts of tribal sovereignty, self-determination, and in a context of an international arena. While taking an intentionally transnational view, this examination specifically centers and focuses on the role and involvement of Native Americans and how they fought to circumvent and work outside and across nation-state borders with and through international Indigenous organizations. While extensive examinations have been conducted on more radical activism of the Red Power movement and groups such as the American Indian movement, which can be seen as images such as this study instead shifts the focus to the more traditional, moderate organized groups that contributed to an international activist shift and who developed strong networks and exchanges in the Indigenous international arena. The study largely examines and posits the inherent links between international indigenous groups around issues of sovereignty, self-determination, and human rights, revealing shared international ideologies, agendas, and patterns rooted in indigenous modes of grounded normativity connected to land, place, and people. Through a comparative case study model of 4 indigenous activist groups across North America, including the International Indian Treaty Council, the National Congress of the American Indian, the National Indian Brotherhood, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, this study examines the complexities of working across colonial-imposed international borders to effect political change, the challenges faced by activists to develop a shared international indigenous movement, and the results of working within an indigenous transnational movement. Specifically, I examine how these organizations utilize human rights rhetoric and strategies as they sought to center Native American rights at the United Nations as a way to influence favorable domestic indigenous policies within the United States. Furthermore, this work examines these organizations in 3 major categories concerning their international sovereignty activism along what I define as a sovereignty activism continuum. First, those seeking full liberation from the nation state, namely the International Indian Treaty Council. Second, those working simultaneously within and outside of the margins of the nation state, the National Congress of the American Indian, the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, and finally, those working directly and often solely within the structures of the nation state, such as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Although each had their own approach and methods along this continuum, the organizations and activists were all seeking a variation of the same goal: increased sovereignty and self-determination connected to land, people, and place, while also imagining a new future for Native Americans in their political relationship with the United States. Overall, this examination highlights the influential role of Indigenous international organizations in building a foundation for a larger global Indigenous movement that advocated for Indigenous human rights, sovereignty, and self-determination. To give you a bit more context and information about these different areas and these groups, I want to highlight each of them quickly to give you an idea how each of them fell along this continuum. So generally, each of these, as I mentioned, were fighting for similar goals, but each had a different way of going about it. So different tactics and different ways that they were approaching the work. Both radical and moderate activists and organizations pursued this international agenda, building on the momentum of increased Indigenous activism in the starting of the 1970s and into the later part of the 1970s. Bringing awareness of the plight of Native Americans within the United States and utilizing different strategies to increase sovereignty and self-determination through these varied approaches. So I'm going to start first with the most well-known approach, which is the more radical or militant approach that is working outside of the nation state. The most radical approach is seen by the International Indian Treaty Council, which called for the increased Native American sovereignty and self-determination through utilizing the international arena to ensure the United States adhere to treaty agreements promised to tribal communities. Yet the group took this even further to seek liberation from the nation state, which refused to honor its treaty agreements. The group's historic attendance at the 1977 United Nations meeting and their receipt of NGO accreditation brought important international awareness of the injustices faced by Native Americans in the United States, but the organization focused too heavily on their most ambitious goal of seeking independence and liberation from the nation state through the recognition of a separate Sioux nation. Although an aspirational, radical goal, eventually, the quest for Sioux liberation from the United States failed due to the lack of a practical, logical, legal solution and a mechanism to create this separate Native American nation, which derailed the larger progress of the Treaty Council within the international Indigenous movement. Furthermore, their grassroots radical approach and lack of a strong internal structure and organizational base unconnected to any larger tribal organization, proved detrimental to the foundational years of the group. Despite these setbacks and challenges, the Treaty Council's early attendance at the UN conference at Geneva in 1977 and their NGO status signaled a major step forward for Native Americans in the international arena and brought both domestic and international attention. For the first time, Americans and international leaders began to pay attention to Native American international activism. Yet even with these initial successes, the organization struggled to find its bearings and establish a solid foundation due to the lack of strong leadership, vision, and a strong national base. While the ascent to and attendance at the Geneva meeting was a remarkable achievement, the leadership and organization-based issues created significant challenges as the group headed into the next decade. Although the Treaty Council would eventually begin collaborating with other Indigenous peoples and groups outside of the United States in the early 1980s, the lack of a larger vision and international collaboration in the early foundational years proved detrimental to building a strong growing base for the organization. Now turning attention to a more moderate group, unlike the more liberatory, radical perspective and unfortunately fraught leadership in the Treaty Council, the Treaty Council led with often scathing rhetoric against the United States, while the National Congress of the American Indian instead focused on direct implementation and changes through cross-border collaboration with the National Indian Brotherhood and later the World Council of Indigenous People. NCAI leaders and other independent activists worked with the confines in the nation state to make more long-term impact through sustained participation with these international groups. The parallel work of the World Congress and World Council of Indigenous Peoples allowed the more organized groups to make substantial long-term changes in forwarding the involvement and recognition of Indigenous peoples in the international arena. Compared to the Treaty Council, the World Council of Indigenous Peoples developed a significant national and international base that worked directly with or alongside the nation-state organizations and collaborated with other Indigenous organizations, namely the National Congress of the American Indian, and similar groups to reach their larger international goal of establishing a collective international Indigenous organization with formal long-term UN recognition. This in turn then created an international strategy and base for the National Congress of the American Indian, with an already established strong national base and vision to engage in the international arena in their own way, collaborating with other similar organizations with shared interests and putting pressure on the United States from the outside in. Unlike the Treaty Council, NCAI sustained years of leadership with a strong national base provided the organization with a more advantageous place to begin to explore and become a part of the national Indigenous agenda in collaboration with the World Council of Indigenous People. This larger international movement and organization became a vehicle for NCAI leaders to begin to explore methods for increasing sovereignty within the international arena and further determining how this could become a formal strategic agenda for a group so deeply rooted in the nation-state structure. Although the international connection and agenda was highest in the mid to late 70s, it did continue through the 1980s and 90s as there was the development of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And finally, the more traditional route, working within the United States, within the nation state. For those working within the more defined structure of the nation state, namely within federal agencies such as the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, these leaders and activists face challenging circumstances within the federal and national structure when highlighting Native American injustices, inequities, and human rights violations. This work proved challenging since they were also simultaneously trying to bring cohesion between federal agencies, tribal communities on the front lines to ensure funding and establish domestic policies. Unlike the Treaty Council and NCAI, Resurgence and resistance within the nation state, particularly these federal agencies, came through more subdued, smaller traditional methods, including participation in legal briefings, policy, or through submitting formal responses to reports such as the Helsinki Accords, as evident from the work of Forrest Gerard and Susan Schoen-Harjo, which I cover in my project. Their activism challenged the structures of the nation state while also still balancing their careers in the larger federal Indian policy infrastructure. Through this work, some BIA leaders began to see how supporting and speaking out on international Indigenous human rights could benefit their domestic work and place pressure on the United States to both adhere to existing legislations and agreements, as well as envision and develop new policies to protect and enhance Native American sovereignty and self-determination for the present and the future. So based upon my research thus far, I have some final thoughts and conclusions I'd like to share with you. Since the mid-1970s, Native American activist organizations, many who I've just mentioned, the Treaty Council, NCAI, National Indian Brotherhood, World Council of Indigenous Peoples, and the BIA, have struggled and petitioned for similar core tenets of the Declaration that I've mentioned, calling for the protection of Indigenous human rights and self-determination, specifically concerning land, cultural heritage, and collective rights. Thus, there is a legacy of international Native Americans' rights and the movement that began in the 1970s. Unfortunately, it took the federal government over 30 years to act upon many of the ideas that began in the mid-1970s by many of these groups. The long fight for the passage of the Declaration signified a major turn in the international Indigenous movement that did indeed usher in a subtle revolution for global Indigenous rights, as noted by Cheryl Lightfoot. The fight for UNDRIP is directly rooted in the mid-1970s with the refusal of the nation state and thinking how many of these organizations they could reframe and reposition Native American sovereignty and self-determination internationally through this rise of international Indigenous activism. Reflecting on this time period and passage of UNDRIP, activists have assessed the legacy of an international Indigenous activism movement that began in the 1970s, reflecting that despite how flawed initial strategies or approaches may have been, the organizations paved the way and set a strong foundation for the UN work to occur in the future. According to Sam Deloria, one of the people I interviewed for this project, the work of the partnership between the World Council of Indigenous People and the National Congress of the American Indian had lasting effects on the eventual development of UNDRIP, the way it developed and some of the questions that they raised along the way. He concluded that UNDRIP, although lacking substantial power, he also balanced that perspective with how the document can be utilized to pressure the United States to enact real change in federal Indian policy regarding sovereignty and self-determination. Finally, he also noted that for all its faults, he said, quote, "I think the whole movement at least put us on the international consciousness, still in a marginal way, just because the issues don't come up with the kind of explosive context that make people pay attention to them," end quote. While the delayed adoption of the Declaration was a major setback after over 30 years of activism, the entire process and eventual acceptance by the United States was a major victory in moving forward the larger change that is needed for the protection of Native American rights and sovereignty. Major changes to and protection of Indigenous sovereignty within the context of the nation-state system, not built for them, will unfortunately take years to undo, repair, and constantly fight back against. It is a movement that continues to the present day, building on the work that began by Native American activists in the late 1970s. The activists and leaders who pursued this international agenda realized early on that the long-term protection and human rights for Native Americans within the nation state could only occur with pressure and awareness at the international level. They set the foundation for the future struggle of placing Indian rights in that international arena, carrying the message forward, and placing this issue on the world socio-political map. These activists and organizations set the foundation for the coming international work, documenting, recognizing, and honoring their efforts, struggles, and determination to fight for Native American sovereignty and self-determination in the international community ensures their legacy lives on for future generations. Thank you.
Let me reintroduce myself. I'm Paul Ryer, the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and we are now live for question and answer following that wonderful presentation. Jennifer, thank you so much for that presentation. Let me start with my own question. I have a lot of questions, but the first one is just a little bit more about your methods. You talked about indigenous methodologies, but I was just curious if you could trace out a little bit, Jennifer, your own studies methodologies. I had a couple of hints, but I'd rather hear it from you than just guess.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, so much for the question and for hosting this Q&A session. So regarding my methods, I mentioned a little bit of what my approach is, but specifically at a higher level in a general context, this study really focuses on having an Indigenous feminist approach to the work, meaning I use that approach because it provides an opportunity to really critique how this time period, how this work has traditionally been seen in history, and particularly how this time period has often reflected, particularly in the American Indian movement. There have been a lot of men at the center, and there are certainly a lot of male activists in this time period that I look at as well, but I'm really trying to have an approach that centers a lot of the work of the Native women as well as really critiquing a lot of the ways that traditionally this time period and historians and others have looked at this time period. So it provides an opportunity to really reframe and restructure this time period in a different way. So in the same vein as using a lot of decolonizing approaches, I use a lot of Indigenous traditional ways of knowing, meaning when I conduct interviews with the people I've talked with, that means listening to them tell stories and tell about their time period during working with these different organizations. Instead of just asking very specific questions, which I certainly do have, I also let them tell their own story from their perspective, because what's also missing in a lot of this history is there certainly are a lot of not only gaps in the history, but there's gaps in the records, in the archives of stories that I know are there or that exist, but just because they're not documented in a more traditional way, whether in letters or records or materials, that doesn't mean that those stories aren't there. That's why it was so important to conduct interviews with activists and with families of the activists, because those stories are there, but they might not be in a traditional way that maybe a historian might see them in an archive. So that also speaks to the issue of the erasure of a lot of Native American history and individuals in the traditional record sense. And so my work is really trying to fill those gaps and ensure that those voices are heard using Indigenous traditional ways of knowing through a lot of conversations and oral tradition.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that was exactly, you've preempted my own next question, and I see finally we have questions coming in, so maybe we can come back to that sometime. But as you know, I work in the Caribbean, and one of my heroes was a Cuban historian, Manuel Moreno Frajinales, and he observed once, offhandedly to him, but to me it was a profound observation, that all the colonial archives we have in the Caribbean are archives by and for the colonial elite, the very slave owners and plantation owners, and they kept records only for their own purposes and only of things that interested them. And that means that inherently erasure is systemic. One of my professors, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot wrote a book about that from an anthropological perspective, but trying to understand how we can reimagine what is an archive in an anthropological sense to try to counter those kinds of erasures. So we could talk all day about that, but we're really, I want to get to our audience's questions. So oh gosh, we got some good ones now. So the first question we have here is from Joel Zapata, your fellow, and who will be speaking in a couple of weeks about his own project. And the question is, were you able to find connections between Native American activists and Indigenous activists in Latin America, or between Native Americans and Latino, or Chicano activists within the United States?
Yes, thanks, Joel, for that question. That's a really important area of the research that I did find a lot of information in that I highlight in one of the chapters, particularly with the National Congress of the American Indian and the National Indian Brotherhood. As the National Indian Brotherhood was developing and creating the World Council of Indigenous People, there were numerous international gatherings and conferences that were put together. And during that time, there were many conversations that took place between these organizations with Latino organizations, South American organizations, and representatives from those countries. And so through those interactions, again, I talk about this extensively in one of my chapters, is that what they quickly realized is both some things that they did have in common, meaning Native Americans here in the United States with Latino and South American organizations, but also some things that were drastically different. And I think I approach it in telling what Native American activists learned from Latino activists and South American activists, in seeing the struggle that they really faced, how much more significant it was than, say, what Native Americans were facing. So it really helped to open the eyes of Native American leaders and activists when they met with these other organizations and other leaders from other countries in a whole different way. It made Native Americans appreciate although there were certain struggles at this time period, it was with recent passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act and many other acts that we're finally seeing a lot of forward motion around increasing Native American rights, whereas with a lot of South American leaders, more of their activism or perspectives was really focused on just basic survival and many things that, and not that Native Americans in some areas of the country weren't focused on that, but it really helped to put in perspective just how the struggle for rights in Latin America was much different than the rights in the United States. So that just touches on a little bit of it. But Joel, I would love to talk more with you about this and my findings, and hopefully we'll get to do that. But I want to get to a few of the other questions as well.
This is from Asma Donahue. Can you talk about any work where Native women have engaged in international policy and advocacy on violence against women, whether against Indigenous women specifically or in ethnic conflicts?
Sure. And I'll talk about that a little bit generally, and then I can also talk about it in relation to my specific study. So related to my specific study, a lot of the work that Indigenous women are doing at this time is across the board in a variety of different organizations and federal organizations as well as international. So it's at all levels and also on the ground. I don't necessarily look at more of the grassroots. I look more at informal organizations, but at all levels, Native American women at this time period, particularly in the mid to late 70s, are looking at how they can advocate for women, Native American women, and how they can ensure that Native American women's rights are protected. Now, this is just very much at the infancy of a lot of those issues and the rights that are trying to be protected. But this is, that has been going on since time immemorial for Native American women always fighting for our rights. But at this time in the 70s is really where a lot of that starts to increase. And then most recently, of course, many Native American women have been focused on fighting for policy around missing and murdered Indigenous women, particularly here in the United States, in Canada, across North America. That is a huge issue right now that many Native American women are focused on, as well as the Violence Against Women Act and how that it can protect Native American women, not only here in the United States, but in Alaska and across North America. So those two areas are some of the two largest areas that we see policy development and advocacy on an international level. And then within the United Nations, there are also policies being developed there for protection of women's rights. And also within the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there's also rights that protect Indigenous women there as well. So Indigenous women are incredible who are doing work at all levels, national, local, regional. And so it happens at all those levels, and there are a credible amount of women. And if you are interested or want to know more, there are many places where you can learn about some of those advocacy areas that I just mentioned, and I'd be happy to share out any of those as well.
We've got a bunch of great questions. Robert, I'm going to skip yours for now because it's a huge question, and I'm going to go to combine the next two questions by Keith and Christopher because they overlap a little bit. And Keith asks, have there been specific parts of the UN system that have been most supportive and cooperative on Native American rights issues? And then Christopher sort of has a broader question. What shared themes and concerns exist in the international Indigenous community that are directly relevant to Indigenous concerns within the US? Okay, so let me leave it at that.
Yeah.
There's a little more detail you can read, Jennifer, but parts of the UN system most supportive?
Sure, I'll address those together and focus a little bit more on Chris's question about what shared themes and concerns exist in the international Indigenous community that are directly relevant to Indigenous concerns, particularly related to the US nation state, because that directly relates to the research I'm looking at for this study. So specifically, what really connects a lot of these issues is the fact that Indigenous peoples were there first, meaning Indigenous peoples in these different countries were there long before these nation states were developed, and also continued to develop and have in practice their own policies, procedures, governments, and how they had already been working with other groups and other nations across these different countries. And then that even continued after the nation states were developed. So what they have in common, of course, are indigenous to these countries, but then also how they have to work with and against the nation state. And another common theme that you see throughout this study and throughout others who look at this is that there's this idea that we must look at international relations in this kind of Westphalian kind of theme and area and policy of how the nation state is at the center, and that's where it all begins. And what I'm really trying to do is decenter that and flip it on its head and say, really at the center are Indigenous peoples and how they've always existed in these international spheres, and really upending how we've looked at international relations, which many other scholars who have also come before me have been trying to do this as well. So I'm doing this work, building on work they have done and working on that. But I know some examples were given here in this question about parliamentary, congressional representation, land ownership. Yes, these are all things that come into play in these countries where Native Americans are collaborating with other groups on these topics. And these are these unifying factors. This is what they meet about, these first conventions and conferences that they all come together on. Initially, like things that we hear about now with the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, all the different 30 different articles that are in that declaration are all related to these issues that you brought up in your question. And really at the center are protecting Indigenous rights and things like language, religion, intellectual property, consultation, free prior informed consent, which leads me to Keith's question too about have there been parts of the UN system that have been most supportive and cooperative on Native American rights? That's a huge question in itself. But what I would focus on is how, and again, how I mentioned in my talk, I spoke with Sam Deloria, who was a very well-known activist during this time and still to this present day. And in conversations with him about UNDRIP, we all know that the document is not legally binding, but as he mentions, it gives weight to these issues in a way, and recognition of these issues. It brings it to the forefront in not only a political way, but also in a way that is more public and in a mindset for whether it's the American public, international people in an international setting. But in that UN system, the places that there have been most supportive is having representatives, special rapporteurs, and then also having specific articles that are really focused in helping certain areas that people work in that are going to benefit tribal communities, whether that's about intellectual property, or as I mentioned, free prior informed consent, ensuring that consultation is done with tribal communities. So things in that way that it gives weight to these issues in a way that this hadn't, or that they had been fighting for and began fighting for and pushing for in this early time period.
This leads beautifully to another question here from Paraskevi Sotali. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering how you approached the use of the category of Indigenous to refer to very diverse cultures across America, as well as how the participants in these movements determined their common indigeneity. I mean, and it's perfect because you were talking about decentering the Westphalian nation state, thank God, because it's still a plague on us all. But here's then that raises exactly this question. So it's a great question for you.
Yeah, and this is a huge issue that comes up in the study in itself. And so how I define it is how they were actually using the terminology in the 1970s. So one of the first things that was done when the National Indian Brotherhood gathered all these different organizations to come together, first for an initial conference and then for a later conference when they actually developed the World Council of Indigenous Peoples. One of the first things that they spent days talking about was how they were going to define Indigenous and what that meant, because it meant who would be representatives, what countries would be represented, and so they came up with this very specific definition. And so that's also the definition that I use in the study. In different contexts, also depends the time period, the organization I'm working with. But essentially, kind of what I talked about before, and the other question is those countries that are indigenous to the land, but then also have these unique relationships with the nation state. Through sovereignty, self-determination, and it might look slightly different in each of the countries, but that is what categorizes who was indigenous. So they were also, of course, including the Sami people and other peoples that even then or today that some in the general public might not understand as being indigenous. And so they had very long conversations about who was going to be included and why people from Greenland and Finland would be included, and not just people from North and South America or from Australia and New Zealand, but it would also include all indigenous people who were originally from those homelands and now suffering and had constantly struggling for their sovereignty embedded in a nation state that was not supportive of their lifeways and traditions. And so that's kind of the category within the study that I focus on. And if we were to talk about it in a different context, it might look different, but that's how I use it within the study.
Fair enough. Question from Greg Bigler. Curious on how driven by traditional people, i.e. Philip Deere, Thomas Bencia, Leon Shenandoah, etc., do you feel the movement during that time period was, and how that influenced the movement?
Yeah, and that's a really great question, because this comes up as a major theme in this study as well, particularly with the people I spoke with, that this was a very tumultuous time coming out of the Wounded Knee takeover and then into other major areas that activists were working in, but really having in-depth conversations about many people who were for or against more radical or militant activists, but then those on the other side that were more moderate but then more traditional people who wanted to stay embedded in traditional ways in Native American religion and lifeways and culture and practicing that. And so there were a lot of people were very vocal about ensuring that they were led and continued to adhere to traditional people and traditional lifeways. And so that also comes up as a major theme, depending on what organization I was looking at or activists. Everybody had very different opinions, but in the general sense, many people in kind of more this moderate organizations, there were many of them who wanted to stay connected to traditional people, and also bring them in as advisors. And not that the more radical or militant groups weren't doing that, but it's definitely a time period where people are talking about what is the best approach, who to include, what perspectives to include, and there are a lot of discussions about how far away to move from traditional people or to keep them embedded in some of these conversations.
A question from senior scholar Carol McLennan. How long did these organizations continue, especially the influential World Congress, or are they still in existence? From your interviews and collection of stories, did you find that some of the individuals, especially women, of organizations continue to work on the international or internal front in other venues?
Yeah, so there are many of these organizations, both at the national level and international level, that still exist. Of course, like the National Congress of American Indians, still one of the most active and representative organizations for Native Americans here in the United States. And on an international level, the World Congress of the American Indian, yes, still does exist, but in a different, under a different name and kind of different leadership. And so a lot of these organizations have evolved over the years, especially as there's been the development of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. A lot of those individuals who started this work in the 70s and then that began in the 80s evolved into these different organizations. And then one of the things that also has been seen, like the National Indian Brotherhood, also evolved into a new organization with a new name in Canada. And so you see each of them just have changed slightly. The ones that seem to have more longevity are ones that are kind of in that, the middle example that I give, that is both within and outside the nation state. So they work more within the nation state, like NCAI or National Indian Brotherhood. Those tended to exist the longest because they were embedded, had existed for quite some time, had a good base, and then could continue because each of them had representatives from all of the tribal nations and had established policies and procedures, and wasn't one that was continually each of them still continue to fight for funding and for structure, but most of them had a strong base and membership. So those are the ones that have existed for the longest time period. Not that the others didn't have strong histories or have their own challenges that they faced, but the longevity and legacy is seen throughout all of these different organizations. And then she also had a question about, did you find some of the individuals, especially women, continue to work on the international or internal fund? Yes, many of these women have continued to work in this area for numerous years. Where you might see them fall out of that area, it might only be because, again, many of these organizations had to fight so hard to get funding, because a lot of these issues might have a strong base from these different Native nations and tribes. But in order to work on these kind of specific issues on international exchanges or going and flying to different countries, even when NCAI went as a representative for the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, they had to raise funds to actually just fly there and to get there. And so there was a lot of challenges with actually getting to a lot of these organizations. So if they fell out of that exchange, it was mainly because they just simply couldn't raise the money, and because they also had to find money to pay themselves and to do this work, because many of them are either lawyers or attorneys or they're special assistants. And for example, like Susan Schoen-Harjo, she began a lot of this work in the 60s into the 70s, and she is still today working on many of these issues in a lot of the work that she does.
We have a question from Larry Bonura. Were any Native women incarcerated for their roles in the 1970s movement, and why? Many men were jailed for their work.
Yeah, so that if there were any women that there were, but a lot of those examples come more from the more radical militant activism, or the where you see more public displays like takeovers, things like that. And a lot of that happened prior to the time I'm looking at. It was kind of happening at the beginning of it, 1974 to 75, of course, with the takeover at Wounded Knee, takeovers at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior, other takeovers that are seen as much more radical activism. So there were definitely women who, even if they weren't incarcerated, they were certainly not treated well. And there were a lot of issues that happened also at Wounded Knee, where women were even attacked or incarcerated. So, but that comes a little bit more before this study that I'm looking at. The time period in the late 70s isn't quite as militant in terms of activism. It doesn't mean that didn't happen in other pockets of areas throughout the United States to Native American women. It certainly did, but you don't see that as much of it as a theme at international activism.
We have a question from Wenda Trevathan. Can you comment on how local identities, such as tribal or community identities, articulate with the larger identities of Native American in these movements? Is there local concern about representation of identity in these national movements?
Yeah, and that's a really great question, and something that definitely came up in this study is because I was also interested in this, because I think when you look at international issues, there's a tendency to, of course, look at it in that way. And many people at this time period coming from tribal communities or who were their representatives had lots of questions about, or would bring up in these conferences and in conversations, why should we care about this international issue when we're at home and we just need funding to survive, or to fund our schools and our health services? Why should we care about an international issue? And so there were lots of conversations in these conferences about these larger international issues and how working at an international level will help them at a domestic and local level. And so, to think about these issues, because it comes up as a major theme and I talk about it in each of my chapters, but I had a really great conversation with Paul Chatt-Smith, who he was an activist in the International Indian Treaty Council. And one of the things that we talked about, and a question that he helped me to really see, is that during this time period, and this is kind of a larger issue that I look at as well, each of these tribal leaders or representatives or people who have these questions it's a really interesting time where everybody is really wrestling with these issues of sovereignty, self-determination, in a way of trying to figure it out. Like, what does this time period look like now after Wounded Knee, but going into a time period where finally there's the passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, other acts that are going to finally provide some protection, and then there's the coming of many tribes being restored from termination. So finally getting a lot of rights back for sovereignty and self-determination, but all of them trying to figure out, what does this look like both domestically and internationally? And then also, how does that trickle down to local issues and local identities? So there's a lot going on here, and there are certainly some through lines and some themes that come up, but a larger question that many of these leaders and activists are looking at is, what does self-determination look like? What does sovereignty look like at this time? And also, how do we incorporate international issues into these questions? And how is that going to help us as we seek to increase self-determination and work in human rights into these issues as well?
Yeah, that's terrific. And finally, I was going to go back to Robert Brown's question, but he's asked it again. So how would Native Americans immediately benefit if the Indian treaties of the 18th and 19th centuries were actually enforced?
Yeah, that's a big question, except a really great thing to think about. If that did actually occur, it would give, not only do we always had sovereignty and self-determination for our people, for our communities, but it would, enforcing those treaties would essentially ensure that the United States government is showing that they recognize them, and also it gives more power back to tribal communities. We've always had that power. That's inherent because we were the first people here. We've always been here, but it gives us political, legal power to enforce the laws and procedures and legal issues that are inherent in these communities and what was written in those treaties, particularly things like land back and finally having control over the land that we are from, that we have resided on since time immemorial, and ensuring that we have those rights and responsibilities to manage the land, to control our collections, whether it's records or materials, or our health and communities. And not to say that we aren't already doing that, but it is definitely more of a struggle when treaties are not enforced, or when they have been broken for hundreds of years. And the struggle, that is why we all continue to do this work, is because we are trying to enforce and show why it's important that treaties are enforced, and also how treaties have been broken and the effects of that.
Well, I think we should end on that note. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, for answering our questions. Jennifer, I look forward to further conversations. Thank you very much. Thank you for attending today, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Goodbye.